Okay, not too much reading. So we're still in section 1, theory of heat, unit 3, refrigeration and refrigerants. 3.7, the evaporator. The evaporator is a heat transfer surface that absorbs heat into the system. When the refrigerant boils at a temperature that is lower than that of the substance to be cooled, it absorbs heat from the substance. The boiling temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit was chosen in the previous air conditioning examples because it is the design temperature normally used for air conditioning systems. The reason is that the ideal room temperature is close to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Sorry, itchy shoulder. Okay, the reason is that the ideal room temperature is close to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which readily gives up heat to a 40 degree Fahrenheit coil. The 40 degree Fahrenheit temperature is also well above the freezing point of the coil, preventing it from freezing under normal system operating conditions. See figure 3.15 for the coil to air relationships. Figure 3.15. The evaporator is operated at 40 degrees Fahrenheit to be able to absorb heat from the 75 degree Fahrenheit air. The evaporator can be thought of as a heat sponge. Just as a dry kitchen sponge absorbs liquid from a spill because the water content of the sponge is lower, the evaporator is able to absorb heat from the temperature of the coil because the temperature of the coil is lower than the temperature of the medium being cooled. Continuing our analogy, the sponge will stop absorbing liquid if it becomes completely soaked. This is why we have to squeeze the sponge to remove the absorbed water. Looking back at our evaporator, if we just keep adding heat to the coil, its temperature will rise and the amount of heat it can absorb will drop. So the heat that is absorbed into the evaporator must be removed later on to allow the system to continue to operate. Let us see what happens as R410A refrigerant passes through the evaporator coil. Figure 3.16. The evaporator absorbs heat into the refrigeration system by boiling the refrigerant at a temperature that is lower than the temperature of the room air passing over it. The 75 degree Fahrenheit room air readily gives up heat to the 40 degree Fahrenheit evaporator coil. The refrigerant enters the coil from the bottom. I'm way too tired for this. The refrigerant enters the coil from the bottom as a saturated mixture of about 75% liquid and 25% vapor. Evaporators are usually fed from the bottom to help ensure that no liquid leaves the top without first boiling off to a vapor. If refrigerant entered the evaporator coil from the top, liquid could quickly drop by its own weight to the bottom before it is completely boiled off to a vapor. Liquid refrigerant, if allowed to leave the evaporator, could enter and ultimately damage the compressor. In addition, since vapor is less dense than liquid, the vapor has a tendency to rise. Since the saturated refrigerant enters the coil from the bottom and leaves from the top, the direction of the refrigerant flow is from the bottom to the top, the same as the direction of the rising vapor. If the refrigerant entered the evaporator from the top and left through the bottom, the direction of flow would be opposite to that of the rising vapor, which would cause the refrigerant to slow down. The refrigerant mixture boils as it flows through the coil, with the liquid being turned to vapor because heat from the heat from the air is being added to the refrigerant. As the refrigerant continues to flow through the coil, the percentage of liquid in the mixture decreases, while the percentage of vapor increases. About halfway up the coil, the mixture becomes more vapor than liquid. The purpose of the evaporator is to boil all of the liquid into a vapor just before the end of the coil. This occurs approximately 90% of the way through the coil, leaving pure vapor. At the point where the last droplet of liquid vaporizes, we have what is called a saturated vapor. This is the point where the vapor would start to condense if heat were removed from it or became superheated if any heat were added to it. When a vapor is superheated, it no longer corresponds to a temperature-pressure relationship because no liquid remains to boil off to vapor. No more vapor pressure can be generated when heat is added. The vapor will now take on sensible heat when heated, and its temperature will rise, but the pressure will remain unchanged. Superheat is considered insurance for the compressor because it ensures that no liquid leaves the evaporator and enters the compressor. Where there is superheat, there is no liquid. The amount of superheat in the evaporator is the difference between the temperature of the refrigerant at the outlet of the evaporator and the temperature at which the refrigerant boils. Referring to figure 3.16, it can be seen that the refrigerant boils at 40 degrees Fahrenheit and leaves the evaporator at a temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This means that this evaporator at a temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, This means that this evaporator is operating with 10 degrees Fahrenheit of superheat. 50 degrees minus 40 degrees equals 10 degrees. To summarize, the three main functions of the evaporator are to 1. Absorb heat from the medium being cooled. 2. Allow the heat to boil off the liquid refrigerant to a vapor in its tubing bundle. 3. Allow the heat to superheat the refrigerant vapor in its tubing bundle. Evaporators, figure 3.17. A typical refrigeration evaporator. Evaporators have many design configurations, but for now just remember that they absorb the heat into the system from the substance to be cooled. Once absorbed into the system, the heat is now contained in the refrigerant and is drawn into the compressor through the suction line. The suction line simply connects the evaporator outlet to the compressor inlet and provides a path for refrigerant vapor to travel. Figure 3.18. The suction line connects to the outlet of the evaporator to the inlet of the compressor. The suction line typically passes through unconditioned or unrefrigerated spaces, and the surrounding air temperature is often much higher than the temperature of the refrigerant line. Heat from the surrounding air can, therefore, be readily absorbed into the refrigeration system, making the system work much harder than needed. For this reason, the suction line is insulated. 3.19. Suction lines should be well insulated to increase system efficiency and capacity and to prevent sweating. A well-insulated suction line helps the system operate as efficiently as possible, and the insulation prevents the suction line from sweating. Okay, that's 2 pages, page 48 and 49. Thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow.